It was a grey April morning in 1943. The North Atlantic stretched like an endless plain of turbulent waters, where gigantic waves crashed against the hulls of merchant ships crossing that corridor of death. At that particular moment in history, the ocean was much more than water and salt. It was an invisible battlefield, where submerged silhouettes hunted their prey with deadly patience, and where men trembled not only from the biting cold, but from the fear that at any moment an explosion would rip open the underbelly of their ships and hurl them into the icy waters that would kill them within minutes. This is the account of one of the most extraordinary moments of the war in the Atlantic, when a German convoy commander's confidence was shattered in just 7 minutes of pure terror from the sky. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Müller was a veteran of the sea. His blue eyes had witnessed 32 patrol missions, and his calloused hands knew every vibration, every sound, every whisper his U-boat could emit. That morning, he commanded not only his own vessel, U-5 or 17, but also supervised a small group of 3 submarines sailing in a loose formation, a tactic known as a wolf pack. Müller firmly believed in the superiority of his vessels. After all, U-boats had dominated the Atlantic for years, sinking millions of tons of Allied supplies, strangling British supply lines, and bringing England to the brink of collapse. For him, this mission would be another victorious page in his already impressive record. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the time you watched this video. Your participation is crucial for us to continue bringing you incredible stories like this. Müller had received intelligence about an approaching Allied convoy, a large convoy with more than 40 merchant ships loaded with essential supplies. Tanks, ammunition, food, fuel, everything the Allies needed to continue the war in Europe. The convoy, designated HX-234, was scheduled to pass through that sector of the Atlantic, and the German Naval High Command had ordered Müller's pack to intercept and destroy as many ships as possible. It was a golden opportunity, and Müller knew it. He gathered his subordinate commanders via coded radio communications, established attack positions, and bided his time. Patience, he always told his men, was a submarine commander's greatest virtue. What Müller didn't know, what none of them knew at that moment, was that the Allies had developed a new weapon in the Atlantic War. A weapon that would come not from the depths but from the skies. A weapon that would completely transform the balance of power in that vast ocean. Consolidated B-24 Liberator maritime patrol bombers had been modified and adapted specifically for submarine hunting. These robust aircraft, with their impressive wingspan and ability to fly for hours at a time over the ocean, were being equipped with new radars, improved depth charges, and, most devastatingly, 50-caliber heavy machine guns mounted in configurations that allowed for absolutely devastating firepower. 120 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force had been specifically assigned to protect Convoy HX-234. Based in Iceland, these pilots and their crews had trained tirelessly for a new tactic, the low-altitude strafing attack against surfaced submarines. It was a risky, almost suicidal tactic that required flying less than 50 feet above the waves, at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, while firing thousands of shells at targets that could retaliate with their own anti-aircraft artillery. But the test results had been promising. The 50-caliber machine guns could pierce the U-boats' pressurized hulls, destroy their deck equipment, kill crew members, and most importantly, force them to dive, halting their attacks on the convoys. On the morning of that fateful day, Air Force Lieutenant James Mackenzie led a patrol of 2 Liberators over the convoy's planned route. Mackenzie was Scottish, the son of Hebridean fishermen, and the ocean was as much in his blood as it was in his spirit. He had lost 2 cousins in the merchant navy, both killed when their ships were torpedoed by U-boats. For him, this mission was not just military duty, it was personal. His co-pilot, Flying Officer Robert Chen, a Chinese-Canadian from Vancouver, carefully monitored the instruments on the new surface search radar installed in the Liberator's nose. It was revolutionary technology, capable of detecting small objects on the ocean surface at impressive distances, even in low visibility conditions. It was exactly 7:42 in the morning when Chen's radar screen lit up with 4 distinct bright spots. He blinked, adjusted the controls and checked again. There was no doubt. 4 surface contacts in loose formation approximately 20 kilometers ahead. Chen touched Mackenzie's shoulder and pointed to the screen. Mackenzie felt adrenaline flood his veins. 4 U-boats, 4 targets. It was more than he had ever expected to find in a single patrol. He looked at his co-pilot and nodded. It was time to put all that training into practice. Mackenzie immediately radioed and contacted the second Liberator, in his patrol piloted by Lieutenant William Morrison, a tall, thin Texan who chewed tobacco constantly and had exceptional aim as a gunner. Morrison confirmed that he had also detected the contacts on radar. The 2 pilots quickly coordinated their attack plan. They would descend at low altitude, approaching the submarines using the waves and morning mist as cover. Once within visual range, they would begin coordinated strafing passes, alternating their attacks to keep the submarines under constant fire and prevent their crews from effectively using their anti-aircraft guns. As the Liberators descended through the cloud layers, Müller stood on the deck of his U-boat, scanning the horizon through his Zeiss binoculars. The sea was relatively calm by North Atlantic standards, with waves only 2 to 3 meters high. Visibility was reasonable, perhaps 5 to 6 kilometers. Perfect conditions for a coordinated attack on the convoy. His other 3 U-boats were positioned in a pattern that would allow them to attack the convoy from multiple directions simultaneously, maximizing confusion and minimizing the effectiveness of the escorts. It was a tactic he had used successfully many times before. Petty Officer Wolfgang Krause, Müller's observation officer, was methodically scanning the sky with his own binoculars. Protocol demanded constant vigilance, but Krause was confident. They were far from known air patrol routes, and Allied aircraft rarely operated so far from their bases at that point in the war. Still, he kept searching, because a single moment of carelessness could mean the difference between life and death. That was why he saw just a second before it was too late. 2 dark dots emerging from the low-lying mist over the waves, rapidly growing in size, approaching at a terrifying speed. Krause shouted the alarm in a voice that rent the morning air like a siren. Enemy aircraft, 2 of them, were approaching fast from the bow. Müller turned instantly, his binoculars focusing on the dots that were rapidly transforming into recognizable silhouettes. Liberators. His eyes widened. Liberators shouldn't have been that far offshore. Liberators didn't have that range. But there they were, and they were coming directly toward him. So low above the waves they seemed to be skimming the ocean's surface. Müller's brain began to process options at a frantic speed. Dive immediately? No, the U-boat would take at least 45 seconds to submerge completely, more than enough time for the bombers to attack. Fight back with the anti-aircraft machine guns. Yes, that was the only option. He barked orders to his crew, all hands to the anti-aircraft guns. Prepare to repel air attack. Men began pouring from the hatches, rushing to their fighting positions, at the twin 20mm cannons mounted in the conning tower. But they were too late. Terribly late. Mackenzie had lined up his Liberator perfectly. He was flying just 40 feet above the waves, so low that his stomach tightened with every ripple that passed beneath his aircraft. His speed was 220 miles per hour. The U-boat was growing rapidly in his windshield, and he could see the small human figures scurrying across the deck like terrified ants. He pressed the firing controls and felt the Liberator shudder violently as all of its machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was incredible. 10 .50 caliber machine guns firing in unison, each spewing finger-sized projectiles at a rate of over 700 rounds per minute. It was as if someone had ripped the very fabric of the air. The tracer rounds formed a brilliant river of orange and red light that streaked across the space between the aircraft and the submarine in fractions of a second. And then, the impact. The first shells hit the water just 10 meters ahead of the U-boat, sending up columns of white foam. But Mackenzie adjusted his aim, and the next volley found solid metal. The .50 caliber shells struck the submarine's hull with devastating force. The sound was of metal being torn apart, shattered and destroyed. The shells pierced the superstructure like paper, tearing off chunks of steel, destroying equipment, and severing cables. One of the German gunners taking up position was literally cut in half by a volley that struck him in the torso. Another had his arm ripped off at the shoulder and was thrown overboard by the impact. The anti-aircraft gun was hit repeatedly, deforming and toppling onto its side, rendered useless before it could fire a single shot. Müller threw himself onto the deck, feeling the shells roar past overhead. The sound was infernal, as if 1,000 demons were tearing metal with their claws. He saw pieces of his submarine flying through the air, saw men falling, saw blood staining the deck. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The Liberator passed over them with a deafening roar from its 4 engines, so low that Müller could have sworn he saw the tail gunner's face looking down as it passed, but there was no time to breathe. Even before the first Liberator completed its pass, the second was already entering its attack approach. Morrison had carefully observed Mackenzie's attack and adjusted his own approach accordingly. He was coming from a slightly different angle, aiming for the submarine's midships, where he knew the ballast tanks and critical hydraulic systems were located. His gunners had been specifically instructed: destroy anything that might prevent the submarine from diving. The second attack was even more devastating than the first. Thousands of shells ripped the length of U-517, piercing the deck, penetrating ventilation openings, and destroying valves and piping. One shell struck a high-pressure vent pipe, causing an explosion of air and oil that threw 2 crewmen overboard. Another pierced the thin hull of the superstructure and ricocheted into the control room compartment, instantly killing the chief engineer and seriously wounding 2 others. The periscope was ripped from its mounting and fell into the ocean like a broken mast. Müller knew he was finished. His submarine was badly, possibly fatally damaged. He shouted the order no U-boat commander wanted to give: abandon ship. Prepare to evacuate. But even this simple order became complicated when he realized that half of his internal communication systems had been destroyed. He had to physically send men through the compartments to relay the order, but U-517's ordeal was far from over. Mackenzie had completed his turn and was lining up for a second pass. And this time he carried something besides machine guns. He carried Mark 24 Fido depth charges, versions modified specifically for launching against surface submarines. He descended again to his suicide attack altitude, and when he was 400 meters from the crippled submarine, he activated the bomb release. 2 depth charges left the Liberator's bomb bay cleanly and accurately, landing in an arc that ended in the water, just 5 meters from the U-boat's hull. They were calibrated to detonate in just 3 meters of water, and when they exploded, the effect was catastrophic. The underwater shock wave struck the submarine's pressurized hull like a giant hammer. Steel plates buckled, welds snapped, joints failed. Seawater began gushing into the hull through dozens of breaches. The U-517 began to list by the bow, its forward end beginning to sink as air escaped from the destroyed ballast tanks. The crew began to evacuate in panic, some jumping directly into the icy ocean, others attempting to launch the damaged lifeboats. Müller was among the last to leave, watching with a mixture of horror and disbelief as his commander, his home for so many missions, began his final descent into the depths. He had survived 32 patrols, weathered storms, depth charges, and determined escorts, but it took only 7 minutes for aircraft from the sky to completely destroy not only his submarine, but also his entire confidence in the invincibility of U-boats. But the story doesn't end there. While the drama of U-517 unfolded, the other 3 submarines in Müller's group were also under attack. Morrison had immediately set out to attack U-489, commanded by Oberleutnant Kurt Hoffmann. Hoffmann had seen what had happened to Müller's submarine and immediately ordered an emergency dive. His crew moved with practiced precision, but they didn't have the necessary 45 seconds. Morrison lined up his Liberator and opened fire just as the submarine was beginning to submerge. The machine guns roared again, and shells pounded the water around the rapidly disappearing conning tower. Several shells struck the conning tower structure before it completely submerged. But the damage was not as severe as on U-517. Morrison released his depth charges, and they detonated very close to the diving submarine. The shockwave severely damaged U-489's hydraulic and depth control systems. Hoffmann managed to keep the submarine under control, but it was bleeding oil from multiple ruptured seals, leaving a telltale trail on the surface that could be followed for hours. The 2 Liberators now had a problem. They had used up nearly all their ammunition in the initial attacks, and were running low on fuel. But there were still 2 U-boats in the group, and they couldn't simply let them escape. Mackenzie made a quick decision. He radioed his base in Iceland and relayed the exact position of the remaining submarines, requesting additional air support immediately. He and Morrison then began making low passes over the 2 remaining submarines, not firing, just flying menacingly close, forcing them to remain submerged or risk attack. The tactic worked perfectly. The commanders of the 2 remaining U-boats, U-322 and U-553, had witnessed the destruction of Müller's submarine and the attack on U-489. They had no intention of surfacing while those lethal aircraft were in the area. They remained submerged, cruising slowly on their electric motors, consuming precious battery power, unable to intercept the Allied convoy they were tasked with attacking. 40 minutes later, reinforcements arrived. 3 additional Liberators from the same squadron appeared over the area, fresh and fully armed. Mackenzie transferred the target coordinates, and then, with their fuel tanks nearly empty, he and Morrison began their long journey back to Iceland. Behind them, the newcomers took up the hunt, relentlessly pursuing the 2 remaining U-boats. U-322, commanded by veteran Kapitän-Leutnant Franz Becker, attempted a desperate maneuver. It sailed an erratic course, frequently changing direction and depth, trying to lose its aerial pursuers. But the Liberator's new search radars were too good. Every time it changed course, they tracked it. When its batteries finally ran out after 5 hours of pursuit, it had no choice but to surface. When the conning tower broke the surface, 3 Liberators were waiting. Strafing attacks began immediately, and within minutes U-322 was so damaged that sinking was only a matter of time. Becker and his crew evacuated and were later rescued by a British destroyer that had been directed to the area. The last submarine, U-553, suffered a slightly different fate. Its commander, the young and aggressive Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich, decided to fight. When forced to surface, he kept his crew at the anti-aircraft guns and ordered them to fire at anything that flew. It was a brave but futile decision. The Liberators simply stayed out of the effective range of the submarine's anti-aircraft guns and subjected it to repeated strafing and shelling. It took 17 minutes, but eventually U-553 too began to sink. Dietrich, seriously wounded in the leg by a fragmented shell, was the last to abandon ship, being pulled into a lifeboat by his loyal men. When the smoke finally cleared and the waters became relatively calm again, the result was incredible. In less than 7 hours, 4 U-boats had been neutralized or destroyed by airstrikes. 3 of them sank completely, and the 4th was so damaged that it had to return immediately to base, unable to continue its mission. Convoy HX-234 passed through the area unmolested, all 42 of its ships arriving safely. Not a single merchant ship was lost. News of the attack spread quickly through RAF Coastal Command and the Royal Canadian Navy. It was a remarkable victory, a clear demonstration that the U-boat's dominance in the Atlantic was coming to an end. New air attack tactics, combined with improved radar and devastating firepower, had completely changed the balance of power. The Sea Wolves now had to fear not only the destroyers and corvettes on the surface, but also the predators that hunted from the skies. For Müller and his surviving men, rescue came 2 hours later, when the destroyer HMS Vanquisher arrived in the area. They were pulled from the icy water, hypothermic, in shock but alive. Müller was taken to the destroyer's deck, where he was treated with professional respect by the British officers. One of them, Commander Thompson, even offered him a cup of hot tea and a blanket. Müller accepted both silently, still processing what had happened. During subsequent interrogations in a Canadian prisoner of war camp, Müller was repeatedly questioned about the attack. Allied intelligence analysts wanted to understand what had worked, what could be improved. Müller answered honestly, because at this point, what could he hide? He described in precise detail the devastating power of the strafing attacks, the speed and precision of the pilots, the utter helplessness he felt as his submarine was literally torn apart around him. He admitted that never, at any point in his training or experience, had he considered the possibility that aircraft could be so lethal against submarines. When interrogators asked what he would have done differently, Müller remained silent for a long time. Finally, he answered nothing. There was nothing I could have done. They were upon us before we could react. Their attacks were perfectly coordinated. Their firepower was superior to anything we had to defend ourselves. It was like being attacked by a storm of steel from nowhere. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Müller's words were recorded and analyzed. They confirmed what Allied strategists were already beginning to understand. The war in the Atlantic had turned a critical corner. U-boats, which had been Nazi Germany's weapon of terror, sinking thousands of ships and killing tens of thousands of sailors, were now vulnerable as never before. The combination of improved intelligence through the breaking of Enigma codes, advanced search radar, and these new devastating air attack tactics meant that the days of submarine dominance were numbered. In the weeks and months following the attack, the tactics developed by Mackenzie and Morrison were refined and disseminated throughout the Allied maritime patrol squadrons. Pilots trained tirelessly, practicing low-altitude passes, attack coordination and ammunition conservation. Gunsmiths worked to maximize the aircraft's firepower, adding more machine guns where possible, improving targeting systems, and developing ammunition even more effective against submarine hulls. The impact on U-boat operations was immediate and dramatic. German commanders became increasingly reluctant to remain afloat during the day, even in areas they had previously considered safe. This meant they had to spend significantly more time submerged, operating on batteries that had limited capacity, drastically reducing their mobility and ability to locate and attack convoys. Battery recharge times, which required the submarines to surface and operate their diesel engines, became increasingly dangerous. The statistics tell the story eloquently. In the first 4 months of 1943, before the refinement of these air attack tactics, U-boats were still sinking an average of 96 Allied merchant ships per month. In the following 4 months, after the widespread implementation of the new tactics, that number dropped to 38 ships per month. And in the same period, U-boat losses increased dramatically, from an average of 8 per month to 23 per month. The math was inexorable. Germany was losing submarines faster than it could build them, while the Allies were building merchant ships faster than they could be sunk. The German Naval High Command, the Oberkommando der Marine, observed these developments with growing alarm. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat force and Hitler's eventual successor as leader of Germany, attempted desperate countermeasures. He ordered the U-boats equipped with more anti-aircraft weapons, transforming them into floating aerial combat platforms. But this only made the submarines slower, heavier, and less effective in their primary role. He attempted to develop new types of submarines, such as the revolutionary type WWII, with their improved batteries and ability to remain submerged for much longer periods. But these designs arrived too late, and in too small numbers to change the course of the war. For pilots like Mackenzie and Morrison, that April day became legendary. They were decorated with the highest military honors. Mackenzie received the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership and exceptional courage in combat. Morrison received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his skill and effectiveness in the attack. More important to them than the medals, however, was the knowledge that their actions that day had potentially saved hundreds of merchant seamen's lives, ensuring that vital supplies reached their destination. Mackenzie continued flying maritime patrol missions for the rest of the war. He participated in 15 more attacks against U-boats, sinking or seriously damaging 6 more. He survived the war and returned to Scotland, where he purchased a small fishing boat and spent the rest of his life on the sea he knew so well. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, but occasionally, when the weather was bad and the wind howled, he would gaze at the horizon and recall that April day when he had helped change the course of history. Morrison also survived the war, returned to Texas, and became a flight instructor, teaching the next generation of military pilots. He always told his students, "Training saves lives." Everything we did that day we did, because we'd trained 1,000 times before. When the real situation arrived, our bodies knew what to do, even when our minds were screaming in fear. As for Müller, he spent the rest of the war in prison camps, first in Canada, then transferred to a camp in the United States. He was treated according to the Geneva Conventions, with respect and dignity. He spent his time in the camp, keeping a detailed diary of his experiences, documenting his 32 patrols, their successes, their failures, and finally, his defeat that April day. After the war, he returned to Germany, which lay in ruins, and helped rebuild his devastated nation. He never returned to sea as a sailor, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned so brutally. Decades later, in an extraordinary twist of fate, Mackenzie and Muller met in person. It was in 1982, during a war veterans conference in London, where survivors from both sides gathered to share their stories and promote reconciliation. Muller was now 81, Mackenzie 78. Both had white hair, both walked with the aid of canes, both carried the weight of memories that had never completely faded. The meeting was organized by historians who had researched the incident and wanted to document the accounts of both men. When they were introduced, there was a moment of awkward silence. Muller looked at the man who had destroyed his submarine and killed 12 of his crew. Mackenzie looked at the man who commanded the weapon that had killed his cousins and thousands of other innocent sailors. For a long moment they just stared at each other. Then Muller extended his hand. Mackenzie took it. They shook hands firmly, and in that grip were decades of history, decades of pain, decades of loss, but also decades of reflection, and finally, understanding. They sat together and talked for hours, comparing their memories of that April day in 1943. Muller described the terror of seeing the Liberators emerging from the mist. Mackenzie described the tension of flying so low over the waves, knowing that a single mistake could plunge him into the icy ocean. During that conversation, Muller said something Mackenzie would never forget. He said, "I spent many years angry, bitter, feeling betrayed by my own command, which didn't adequately prepare us for what you had developed. But eventually I realized that anger was futile. We were all just doing our jobs, following orders, trying to survive in a war none of us really wanted. You did what you had to do, just as I did what I had to do. And now, so many years later, I'm grateful that we both survived to tell our stories." Mackenzie replied, "I've never celebrated what I did that day. Yes, we saved the train. Yes, we changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. But I also took lives, destroyed homes, and caused pain to families I never knew. For years I wondered if there was another way, if we could have achieved the same victory without so much bloodshed. But the truth is, war doesn't offer easy choices. It offers only necessary choices." That conversation was recorded and transcribed, becoming part of the Imperial War Museum's permanent historical archive. It offers a unique perspective on that fateful day, presenting both sides of the story with brutal honesty and profound humanity. But to fully understand the significance of what happened that April day, we need to look at the broader context of the Battle of the Atlantic. This battle, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, was the longest military campaign of the entire Second World War. It was also one of the most crucial. Winston Churchill later said that the only thing that truly frightened him throughout the war was the threat of U-boats. He understood, as few others at the time did, that Britain was completely dependent on supplies coming across the Atlantic. Food, fuel, raw materials, ammunition, everything had to cross that perilous ocean. If the U-boat succeeded in cutting these supply lines, Britain would be forced to surrender, regardless of how brave its soldiers or how determined its people. At the height of the U-boat campaign, during what the Germans called the Golden Age of 1941 and 1942, it seemed that submarines might actually achieve this strategic objective. Allied merchant ships were being sunk at an alarming rate. In November 1942, 117 ships were sunk in a single month, totaling over 700,000 tons. British and American shipyards could not build ships fast enough to replace the losses. British ports began to experience food shortages. Rationing became increasingly severe. The population's morale began to falter. It was against this somber backdrop that Mackenzie and Morrison's raid in April 1943 took on its true significance. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It wasn't just a stunning tactical victory. It was a demonstrable turning point in the most important campaign of the war. It was proof that the Allies had developed the tools and tactics necessary to defeat the U-boat threat. It was the moment when the tide literally began to turn. In the following months, more and more maritime patrol squadrons adopted the same tactics. The Liberators were supplemented by other aircraft types, including the British Short Sunderlands, large seaplanes that could operate directly from the waves, and the consolidated Catalinas, which had even greater range. All were equipped with the same advanced radars, the same improved depth charges, and the same devastating firepower. The Atlantic was divided into overlapping patrol zones, ensuring that few areas remained unobserved by air. The results were spectacular. In May 1943, just 1 month after the attack that destroyed Müller's group, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. It was the largest monthly loss the German submarine force had ever suffered. Dönitz, faced with these catastrophic losses, was forced to temporarily withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic, recognizing that continuing operations there was virtually suicidal. It was the first time during the entire war that the Germans had ceded control of the Atlantic. It was the beginning of the end for the U-boat campaign. But as we celebrate this strategic turning point, we must also remember the extraordinary human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic. Official statistics show that of the 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat force during the war, 30,000 died. A mortality rate of 75%. It was the highest mortality rate of any military branch of any nation during the entire Second World War. These men, mostly young men in their 20s, sank to the bottom of the ocean in steel coffins, often without any hope of rescue, facing horrific deaths by drowning, crushing by pressure, or asphyxiation. On the Allied side, approximately 36,000 merchant seamen lost their lives when their ships were torpedoed. These men were not professional soldiers. They were civilian workers, many of them volunteers who knew the risks but chose to sail anyway, because they understood their work was essential to victory. When their ships were hit, often in the middle of the night in stormy weather, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast, their chances of survival were slim. The icy North Atlantic Ocean kills from hypothermia in less than 15 minutes. Even those who managed to get into lifeboats often died of exposure, dehydration, or starvation before being rescued. These numbers are not just statistics. Each one represents an individual life, a unique story. A family that lost a father, a son, a brother, a husband. They represent unfulfilled dreams, unlived futures, wasted potential. When we think of Mackenzie and Morrison's raid, we must remember not only its tactical brilliance, not only its strategic importance, but also the 12 men of U.S. Navy SEALs who died that day. They too had families. They too had hopes and fears. They too were human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. The story of Müller's U-boat raid also teaches us important lessons about military innovation and adaptation. The Germans at the beginning of the war had a significant technological and tactical advantage with their U-boats. They developed wolf-pack tactics that were devastatingly effective. They had submarines superior to those of any other nation. They had experienced commanders and well-trained crews, but they failed to adapt when the Allies began developing countermeasures. They failed to anticipate how radar technology would fundamentally change the nature of anti-submarine warfare. They failed to recognize quickly enough that their tactics needed to evolve. The Allies, on the other hand, demonstrated remarkable innovation and adaptability. When U-boats began inflicting unacceptable losses, they didn't just accept the situation. They invested heavily in research and development. They developed new radars, new sonars, and new weapons. They experimented with new tactics, constantly refining their approaches based on actual combat experience. They created training systems that rapidly disseminated lessons learned throughout the force. And crucially, they were able to mass-produce these new technologies and train new crews, using their industrial superiority to compensate for initial tactical deficiencies. This capacity for innovation and adaptation is a lesson that remains relevant today. In any conflict, in any competition, those who stop learning, who stop adapting, who become complacent about their initial successes, will eventually be outmatched by more agile and innovative adversaries. Müller learned this lesson the hard way that April Day. Another fascinating dimension of this story is the role of intelligence in the Allied victory. What neither Müller nor his superiors knew at the time was that the British had broken the Enigma codes the Germans used for encrypted radio communications. Through Project Ultra, based at Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts were routinely decoding German messages, including orders sent to U-boat groups. This meant the Allies often knew where the U-boats were positioned, what tactics they planned to use, even how much fuel and torpedoes they had available. This intelligence was crucial in directing air patrols to the right areas. It was no coincidence that Mackenzie was flying exactly over the area where Muller's group was positioned. He was directed there based on ultra-intelligence that had decoded Donitz's orders for that specific group of U-boats. Of course, this information was kept strictly secret for decades after the war. Even pilots like Mackenzie didn't know the true source of the intelligence that guided them to their targets. They simply received coordinates and went to investigate. This hidden layer of history adds another dimension to our understanding of the raid. It doesn't diminish the courage or skill of the pilots, who still had to fly the dangerous missions and execute the difficult strikes, but it contextualizes their victory within a much larger system of integrated warfare, where intelligence, technology, tactics, and individual courage all played essential roles. The story of that April day also illustrates how modern warfare had become fundamentally three-dimensional. In the past, naval warfare was fought exclusively on the ocean's surface, ship against ship. The introduction of the submarine added an undersea dimension, forcing surface ships to worry about threats from below. And now, with the development of effective maritime patrol aircraft, naval warfare had gained a third dimension, with threats from the skies. U-boats, which had become dominant by adding the undersea dimension to naval warfare, now found themselves vulnerable to the air dimension they could not effectively counter. This evolution continued after World War. First, the Cold War saw the development of nuclear submarines that could remain submerged indefinitely, eliminating the vulnerability of World War II U-boats to needing to surface regularly. It saw the development of anti-submarine helicopters that could operate from ships and were even more effective than fixed-wing aircraft. It saw increasingly sophisticated sonar systems, guided torpedoes, and smart mines. The arms race between submarines and anti-submarine forces continues to this day, with each side constantly developing new technologies and tactics to outperform the other. But returning to that specific day in April 1943, we must also consider the individual experience of the men involved. Imagine being on the deck of that U-boat, one of the German gunners rushing to your fighting position. You hear the alarm call turn and see two massive aircraft roaring toward you, so low they look as if they're about to crash into the waves. You know what's about to happen, but you're paralyzed for a split second by the sheer terror of the sight. Then training takes over, and you rush to your weapon, but even as you run, you know deep in your soul that it's already too late. And then the shells begin to arrive. The sound is like nothing you've ever experienced. It's deafening, unearthly, apocalyptic. You see metal being ripped from the deck in front of you. You see the man beside you fall cut by the shells. You feel fragments of hot metal passing inches from your body. You crouch, try to make yourself small prey to whatever power is listening. And then, as quickly as it began, it ends. But you know there's another ship coming and another after that, and there's nowhere to hide, no way to escape. You're trapped on an open platform being torn apart around you, and all you can do is wait for death or the miracle of survival. Now imagine being in the Liberator, Mackenzie, or one of his crew. You're flying so low that the waves feel like they're going to swallow your aircraft at any moment. You're hurtling at 200 miles per hour toward a target with guns trained on you. You know that if a single anti-aircraft shell hits your engine, your fuel tank, or your cockpit, you'll crash into the ocean and likely die of hypothermia before any rescue can arrive. Your hands are shaking on the controls, but you force yourself to keep them steady, because lives depend on you doing your job perfectly. You align your sights, adjust to compensate for wind and speed, and then squeeze the trigger and feel your aircraft shudder as the machine guns roar. You keep your finger on the trigger as you pass over the target, and only in the last split second do you pull back on the stick and climb, feeling your stomach sink from the G-force, and then you're passing over the submarine and can breathe again. But only for a moment, because you need to turn and prepare for the next pass. These individual human experiences, this visceral terror, this courage under extreme pressure, these are the true components of the story we're telling. Statistics and strategic analysis are important to understanding the historical significance, but it's these human experiences that allow us to truly understand what happened that day. We must also consider the families waiting at home, the wives of Miller and Mackenzie, who woke each morning not knowing whether their husbands were alive or dead, the mothers of U-boat crewmen, who received censored letters that rarely revealed where their children were or what they were doing, the children of merchant seamen, who could go months without hearing from their parents, living in constant anxiety. These people too were victims of war, wounded by weapons made not of steel but of fear and uncertainty. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic had cost approximately 75,000 lives, divided among German submariners, Allied merchant sailors, and naval personnel on both sides. 3,500 merchant ships had been sunk. 783 U-boats were destroyed. Billions of tons of resources had been consumed. And for what? To determine whether supplies could cross an ocean. It seems almost absurd when put in those terms, but it was absolutely crucial to the outcome of the war. Had the U-boats succeeded, had they succeeded in cutting off British supply lines, history would have been very different. Britain might have been forced to negotiate a separate peace. The invasion of Europe might have been impossible. The war might have dragged on for years longer, with millions of additional deaths. Mackenzie and Morrison's raid, and the thousands of similar actions by other maritime patrol crews, literally helped save the world from a tyranny that had caused unimaginable suffering. Today, when we visit war museums and see exhibits about the Battle of the Atlantic, we often see model ships, uniforms in display cases, perhaps a preserved U-boat periscope. These are inert, silent, safe objects. It's easy to forget them as interesting but distant historical artifacts. But each of these objects represents real human stories, real lives, real choices, made under extraordinary pressure. That periscope was used by a real man to search for targets, knowing that each ship he sank meant dozens of deaths. That uniform was worn by a real sailor, who may have died when his ship was torpedoed on a freezing night. These are not just artifacts, they are testimonies. And it is our duty, as a generation living in relative peace thanks to the sacrifices of those who came before, to remember these stories. Not to glorify war, because war is always a tragedy, even when necessary, but to honor those who served, to learn from their experiences, and to ensure we never forget the true cost of the freedom we enjoy. When Mackenzie returned home to Scotland after the war, he went through a difficult period of adjustment. Like many veterans, he had frequent nightmares, waking in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of machine guns and seeing the faces of dying men. He struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why he had lived when so many others had died. His wife, Margaret, was patient and understanding, giving him space when he needed it, support when he asked for it. Slowly, over months and years, the psychological wounds began to heal, though never completely. Müller had a similar experience. Returning to a devastated, ruined, occupied Germany, he had to deal not only with his own traumatic memories, but also with the collective shame of what his nation had done during the war. He had to confront the knowledge of the Holocaust, the extermination camps, and the atrocities committed in the name of the regime he had served. He had to reconcile his own personal honor and professionalism with the fact that he had served a deeply evil cause. It was a decades-long process, painful and never fully resolved. Both men, in different ways, dedicated their post-war lives to promoting peace and understanding. Mackenzie became active in veterans organizations, working for international reconciliation. Müller worked with youth groups in Germany, teaching them about the dangers of extreme nationalism and totalitarian ideology. In their later years, both participated in historical documentaries, sharing their stories with younger generations who had no direct memory of the war. There's a particularly moving recording of a talk Mackenzie gave at a school in 1995, just 2 years before his death. A student asked if he considered himself a hero. Mackenzie was silent for a long moment, then replied, "No, I'm not a hero. I did what was necessary under extraordinary circumstances. True heroes are those who were able to remain completely human, completely compassionate, completely moral, even in the midst of the hell of war. I've had moments of rage, moments of despair, moments when I let fear or anger control my actions. But I try to be better now. I try to use the lessons I've learned to build a world where young people like you never have to face the choices I faced." These words capture something essential about the nature of war and courage. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite fear. True heroism is not glory or celebration, but the quiet performance of duty under extreme circumstances. And true wisdom is recognizing that even in victory, there is loss, even in need, there is tragedy. As we reflect on this extraordinary story of the attack on Müller's U-boats in 7 devastating minutes in April 1943, we should carry it with us not as a tale of simple triumph, but as a complex narrative of choice, consequence, innovation, sacrifice, and ultimately humanity. It is a story that teaches us about the nature of modern warfare, the importance of adaptation and innovation, the human cost of conflict, and the capacity for reconciliation and forgiveness that allows humanity to move forward even after the most terrible traumas. It is also a story that reminds us that the peace we enjoy today was bought with the blood and sacrifice of a previous generation. They faced a darkness that threatened to consume the entire world, and through courage, determination, and unimaginable sacrifice, they prevailed. We owe them not only our gratitude, but our commitment to ensuring that the horrors they faced are never repeated. And so, as we conclude this remarkable story, we must pause to give thanks. Thank men like Mackenzie and Morrison, who risked everything in defense of freedom. Thank the merchant mariners who sailed through dangerous waters, knowing that each voyage could be their last. Thank even men like Müller, who, despite serving on the wrong side of history, later demonstrated the human capacity for growth, reflection, and contribution to a better world. But above all, we must give thanks to the Lord God, who in his infinite wisdom and mercy guides humanity through even the darkest periods of our history. It was by the grace of the Lord God that men found courage when there should have been only despair. It was by the providence of the Lord God that innovation and determination prevailed over tyranny. It was by the compassion of the Lord God that mortal enemies could eventually meet in peace and reconciliation. And it is by the Lord God's continuing will that we can learn from the past, cherish the present, and build a better future for those who come after us. May the Lord God continue to bless all those who served, all those who suffered, and all those who still work for peace and justice in our troubled world. Amen.